Welcome to you all and good evening. My name is Anna Spooner. I am the Tastings and Events Coordinator here at the Wine Society, and I'm delighted this evening to bring you an event all about port. As I'm just letting everyone in, I'll just explain a little bit behind the scenes. As always, for our sip size sessions, we have the lovely Mahesh behind the scenes. Hi, Mahesh. I hope you're enjoying a glass of port with us tonight. For anyone not joined the game, please do feel free to use the chat, as I can see some of you already are. Let us know where you are and what you're drinking. Hopefully you have a port of sorts, or at least you're a fan of port, should we say, and know what we're going to be talking about this evening. And for anybody who wants to use the Q&A, please do so, because that's the best place to put your questions. If you write in the Q&A, Mahesh and I can manage the questions as we go along. He very kindly helps me out behind the scenes, and that does make life easier so that I can answer the questions at the most appropriate time. I have allowed a bit of time for questions, but hopefully you'll see there's a lot to get through with basically an entire style or category of wine. So that's probably it from me. I think that's all we need to start with. If you are drinking along with me, tasting along with me this evening on your introduction to port, I have suggested, some of you may have thought, oh, what a curious order. There's method to my madness. We're going to start with the Natura Organic, then we're going to go to the Tawny, and then we've got the Quinta, single Quinta Douro. Now, it is a vintage port. So if you are tasting along with me, I haven't decanted it, I poured it, and it's going to have had enough oxygen. But if you are continuing to drink the bottle this evening, you might choose to decant it, or you might also just not pour too much from the bottom. The reason I say that is you will find sediment in this wine. So just be a little bit more careful than normal. I've got one of the lovely little port sieves that you can pour it through, but just be a little bit more careful with this wine compared to the other two, because you will find sediment if you're tasting along with any vintage or single Quinta wine. So without further ado, let's start, because my goodness, we really have got a lot to go through. So the basics of port, let's start with the real fundamentals. It's a sip size after all. So if you're really unfamiliar, then hopefully there are a few points that you need to know before we start. It is a fortified wine. So what I mean by that is a wine that has been had a spirit added to it. So in this case, a grape brandy. And that puts it in the same category as sherry, Madeira, Vin Naturel, to name a few. You still use normal grapes, but that grape brandy is what is fortifying it. It is not, therefore, the same as things like Sauterne or Tokai. Those are sweet wines, but with no additional spirit added. The easiest way to tell is that the alcohols on ports are higher than you would find with a normal wine. So you're looking in the region of 18 to 20% alcohol. So hence why you should be a little more careful when sipping along this evening, because it's much easier to drink a little more than you expected with port. So that's what a fortified wine is. But what makes port so special? I think we need to talk about the history first. Really quickly, I'll show you where it is. And the reason is it is important. So Porto, which is the town opposite, you don't really need to know that. But Porto is where we imagine port coming from. And it's opposite a place called Villanova de Gaia, which is where they age, or historically have aged, the ports. Now, that is quite naturally by the sea, so it's port. And it's in the northern part of Portugal, but it is still very warm. I'm going to talk about the Douro River and the temperatures, which hopefully you can see my cursor, but the temperatures going up the river and how the climate changes through the production zone shortly. But what you really need to know is that it's a port, and therefore it's very easy to move wine out of the area. And port really exists because, great things come from wars with France, should we say. What do I mean by that? Well, actually, I should say that quickly, my parents live in France. I'm not trying to be mean, but during the 17th century, there was a trade war with France. And so there was a ban on French imports into the UK, or into England more specifically. And so it drove all of the merchants to find new places to find particularly hearty red wines. And they tried the Portuguese coast. They found that the sort of quick fermented styles of wine, which are the basis for port, were very intense, but they were quite astringent. And so they decided to add a little bit of brandy, which did keep it sort of fortified them in the sense that we know for, in this case, leaving a bit of natural sugar in them, but it also made them stable. It was really not to do with flavor that they added the brandy, it was to keep them stable in the ship. However, the region was really marked with scandal, and a lot of people were copying the styles of wine that were produced from this region here, and which is from the Douro. And so what happened, this bright green region you can see here, sort of a lemony lime color, and this is where all the wine was coming from, or I should say all the grapes, and then it was being moved down to Porto. And there was a big problem. These wines were very popular, but people were trying to steal the identity. So they were adding, I think it's elderberry juice and sugar, and they were adding that to other wines to try and copy this style. So in the 1700s, mid 1700s, the Marquis of Pombal actually made the Douro region the first protected region in the world. We spoke about Châteauneuf-du-Pape last week, and we spoke about how it was the first AOC of France. This is actually the first delineated region on record in the world. So it's a really special place. It's also incredibly special in the Douro for the pure geography and geology. I hope you'll indulge me. I've actually thrown quite a lot of my own photographs in here because I mean, I was there not too long ago, just a couple of months ago, and I was blown away. I've been to Porto before, I've enjoyed Porto all my life, but seeing the Douro region in person, this very different region up here along the river and in the hills, was amazing. I mean, I say hills, I really mean mountains. I'm going to come back to this map in just a moment, but these were the photos I literally took from right to left. Schist soils, granite soils, unbelievably steep slopes. In fact, it's the most famous mountainous viticultural region in the world. It is the most mountainous region. I can't remember the exact statistic, but I think it's over 90% of the entire area is at a 30% incline. So the reality is that up until recently, and we'll touch on this in a moment, but mechanization is and was impossible. So you can sort of see some of them here. This is actually taken at Malvedos, which is one of the quintas that goes into Graham's Port. And you can see they're not quite as steep here at Bonfim, but you can certainly see at Malvedos the terraces that have sort of been hacked into the hillside. And these were hacked into the hillside in the 19th century, and very much an actual terrace shape was created. So you had sort of a proper staircase. Now, those terraces were built with stone walls, very expensive to maintain, almost impossible to maintain. So all through the 19th century, they tried to do that. But then in the 1970s, they decided to build earth banks instead, called patamares, which are very popular now and much easier to maintain. But you really needed to be able to get a digger in to do that rather than build the stone wall terraces. You can have something now called vertical terracing, but it's terrible for erosion. If you can imagine those steep slopes and you grow your vines up and down rather than side to side. So here we can see them beautifully flowing side to side, not in straight lines, and that's also worth saying. They flow with the contours of the mountains, which is incredible. If you imagine them going up and down, you can do it in certain vineyards, but if you imagine it in all of them, all of the soil basically ends up at the bottom. It's awful for erosion. So you end up with these incredible terraces that look like they've almost been mauled by a cat and a cat's claw all around the side of it. The other thing about the region that's really worth commenting on is that you can see down, I wanted to include these pictures, you can see down at the bottom the railway. The railway was running along the river, but actually there was no electricity. So without electricity, you couldn't mechanize. Even if you wanted to, you couldn't. So until recently, there was no modernization in the region. Beautiful wines, but really, really hard work to produce beautiful grapes here. The region itself, and I'll go back to my map now, is actually sheltered from the Atlantic by the Serra de Maro Mountains. Gosh, that was a bit of a mouthful. Promise I haven't had any port yet. But it is a hot region, and it's very dry. To say it's extreme is not an underestimation. It's built, it's been delineated into 3 regions within the Douro. And yes, okay, the delineation is a lot down to where the rivers and certainly the estuaries, like particularly here, the Corgo River, which divides the Baixo Corgo and the Cima Corgo, which is the lower Corgo, or lower than the Corgo, to the west, and then the Cima Corgo, which you can see hopefully on your screens to the right, which is upstream of that tributary river. But actually, you can not only delineate by things like that, but also by rainfall. And there are 3 distinct styles, or 3 different types of grapes or wines that you can produce from the regions. So the Baixo Corgo is the lowest, and it is the wettest and the coolest. And if you imagine why, if we go back up to our picture of Portugal here, it is the one that is closest to the Atlantic. So although it's protected, that is the closest one. So we're getting the most influence from the rain and the coolest influence from the sea. So there's about 900 millimeters of rain, I think it is, in the Baixo. You then move into the Cima, and the Cima Corgo is, this is a map from Taylor Fladgate, I should say. So there are other quintas, but I just thought this was a fantastic map. Vargelas is one of the most famous, but what you actually tend to find is most of the quintas, so most of the single vineyard, I suppose today you'd call them chateau in France. It's not really what they are, but most of the single quintas are found around the town of Pinhão, which you can see on your map here, and that is in that Cima Corgo. And Cima Corgo is a few degrees hotter, so around, let's say, 2 degrees hotter Celsius in the summer, and drier, about 200 millimeters less rain, so around 700. There are lots of high quality grapes produced here and lots of famous quintas, like I said. But that's not to say that there aren't famous quintas as we go up into the Douro Superior. Now, the Douro Superior is very remote. There are things going on up here, but it's and this is pardon me, where we stayed, but it is quite treacherous, and there were rapids up in this part here, which are quite scary, and it was remote, and so there was not a lot of grape growing. It is even hotter again, so you add about another 3 degrees as you get less influence from the Atlantic, so even hotter than the Cima and the Baixo Corgo. And the only sort of people are rushing to it with a huge love because it's flat. It is the flattest of the 3. I say flat, take it with a pinch of salt. We're still in the Douro here, but it is flatter. And so it is the region where mechanization might work. And I will talk in a moment about, we'll taste in a wine in a sec, don't worry. But there is a problem with people leaving the Douro. They're having a massive loss of labor, and actually this could potentially be a very attractive place for fine wine in the future because of that ability to mechanize. So just so you know, this is actually Pinhão, so you can see just from another point of view. It's very hard to grow grapes here, and the main thing I want to say is lots of the producers will pick different places. You can't see too much here, but this is us at Quinta Malveiros, and here we're looking at the list of when they're picking. It's huge Excel spreadsheets because there are so many tiny little plots. And one thing about the Douro is it's still dominated by lots of small growers and buying grapes. And we don't have time to go into it today, but there's a huge grape rating system by vineyard, and they get scored from A to H, and the beneficio has to say how much money each vineyard gets. It's so complicated, but that complication is what adds complexity. Sometimes simple is beautiful in the likes of Burgundy, one vineyard, one site, one expression, and then sometimes in places like the Douro, it's the complexity that adds the magic. So it's very cool. Last but not least, and I'm going to do this quickly, I'm going to talk about how it's made, but I encourage you, whilst I do that, if you haven't already started tasting a wine, please, please do. Oh, Mark said he's being a little extravagant with a War 1985 vintage. Why not, Mark? It's a Wednesday. I wish I could be so extravagant. But how lovely. Do, if you haven't started tasting, please start tasting. And I'll quickly tell you a bit about how it's produced. It's the most important thing to remember about port is that it's quite quick and quite an aggressive fermentation. So technically you're just putting oh, sorry, it's a Tuesday. My week's running away with me. I was in Sheffield last night for a sparkling wine tasting. I feel like I've done 3 days at work this week already. So it is a Tuesday. Even more reason, Mark. Sorry. So yes, the main thing to remember about port, you're putting the same grapes in that you would for many other styles of wine. And even one of the grapes in port I'll talk about, hopefully, if we get time, is the Tempranillo grape, not called that here, it's Roriz. I'm glad people are laughing in the chat about my whoopsie-daisy. The main difference is where you would say take Tempranillo, it's a great example, where in Spain, in Rioja, for example, you would take it and you'd have a lovely long, slow fermentation, perhaps over 2 or 3 weeks, where you'd be slowly plunging the cap and you'd keep your temperatures at about 25 degrees Celsius. Here you don't do that. You want your fermentation to happen quickly. And the reason you want that is you are going to stop the fermentation. But before you stop it, you want to extract color and you want to extract tannins and flavor. And that's what's happening during fermentation. So you want to extract as much as possible before you're adding in that brandy or that grape spirit. Because what you're doing is you're taking a really unctuous, luscious juice, getting as much out of it as you can, but waiting whilst the sugar is fermenting into alcohol. You're then dosing it and you kill the yeast that was doing that conversion of sugar to alcohol. So you kill the yeast by basically drowning them in booze. And then because those yeast have died, the sugar can still remain in the wine. That's not the case with things like dry sherry, where they allow the sugar to convert all of the yeast to convert all the sugar to alcohol, and then they add the brandy. What's most important in port is that they add it at some point midway through. Now, some are slightly drier than others styles, so have less sugar in, and of course you want the yeast to have done a bit more work and converted more sugar. But in this case, the wines that we're tasting tonight, the tawny's a little on the drier side, I'd say, of compared to the first wine, but we are looking for sugar. That's what we want. We want that sweet richness. We want the thing that goes with Roquefort. We want the thing that goes with, in some cases, some delicious pudding. I've got some dark chocolate as well for later. But what that means is all ports are sweet. Fundamentally, there is sugar in all ports to a varying degree. It also means that all ports, I've already mentioned, are 18 to 20 degrees of alcohol. So there are some common similarities in the world of port. And the beautiful thing is, because grape brandy has got so much better, the quality is fantastic. The other thing that's improved, and I just want to show you this before we move on, because everybody still loves the idea that all port is foot trodden. Some is, and actually we are going to talk about the final wine. I've put it in on purpose because it's gone back to foot treading. However, here you can see Graham's treading with these most incredible new machines. I mentioned there's a problem with people leaving the region. They're running out of manpower, quite literally. And the way that the feet tread the grapes is when they were treading, they wouldn't be firm enough or robust enough to break pips and get bitterness. So they needed to have something that would be soft enough. And this reminds me of a big Lego, but actually it's silicon on the bottom. And it's basically pushing, we watched it at work, it sort of pushes down and moves up and down what is called a lagar, which are these big, historically they were big granite troughs. But here we've got stainless steel. Symington's developed this mechanical foot. Taylor's developed their own mechanical foot. So really impressive stuff. But the aim of the game for both is to get maximum extraction, but without the bitter pips and seeds. And it does negate the need for foot treading, but some people like to do it anyway. There is an entirely other way of producing port, which is called an auto-vinifier. It's a lot less, well, it's probably too technical to go into this evening. It's a lot less romantic, and the wines that we're using tonight haven't used auto-vinifiers. So I won't go into it too much, but it's another, it was a very helpful way because it doesn't use electricity. It uses the carbon dioxide gas to push the grapes around, basically, like a little jacuzzi of wine. So I've got a few questions coming in, and I'll ask them as I go. I have clocked them, so don't worry, but I think it's important we talk about our first wine first, because we are talking about the producer I have already just mentioned, which is Graham's. Graham's we are the exclusive UK distributor of this wine, so it's a Wine Society exclusive, and it comes from, if you've tried a Graham's Reserve Ruby before, this is the same production process as that. So if it's a wine style you like, the difference here is these are organic grapes. And one of the big things about the region of the Douro is they can be organic. There is enough rainfall, but not too much. And therefore the vines have to dig really deep. They can work really hard, but actually they are perfectly good in sort of drier and more arid conditions. And that means less spraying, but it also means less things like mildews and rots because the water's not coming in. They're also big on rewilding. They're doing huge projects, the Symington family who own Graham's, with planting things back into nature. So this particular wine was grown at sites, so I mentioned earlier they're often a blend, between 150 and 300 meters above sea level. And what that means is it's got that beautiful bit of dryness. You're not too close to the river, and it's nice and fresh. It spends 4 to 5 years in an old oak cask, so you shouldn't really be able to taste woody flavors in this. And I'll go on to, we're going to go big on types of port in a moment. But it's 4 or 5 years in large oak, so not too much influence, not like the little casks, but it's had a little bit of aging before it's gone into the bottle. It doesn't need to be aged further. Once they're sending this to you, it is ready to drink, and they encourage you, once you've opened it, to also drink it within 4 to 6 weeks. So let's have a little taste. If anybody else is just drinking a regular Ruby Reserve, you're probably going to get some similarities in flavour. So it's often a reserve will be very fresh fruited. This is awful. It's the port I use in cocktails because it's the cleanest, sort of almost crystallized fruit. So blueberries, I get blackberries. There's a classic touch of chocolate, which is quite Graham's, but it's not actually chocolatey or nutty like a tawny would be. It's almost like a mocha. It's got a bit of red fruit for me too, so almost candied strawberries and touch of menthol. I don't know whether any other members are getting that ever so slight touch of menthol, but it's very refreshing. And I think that's how I'd want to describe it. It's a refreshing nose. So let's have a taste. So this is sort of port in its the reason I wanted to start with this wine is this is port in its purest form in many ways. The grapes haven't seen too much aging to make them very developed. They're also just lovely regular ruby grapes. So these would be affordable ports that everybody could have at home and not feel upset about opening, not feel worried about drinking half of the bottle amongst friends, or maybe a full bottle amongst friends. And it's got that beautiful freshness. Ports generally aren't high acid wines. You'd be looking to something like a Madeira for that real touch of acidity on a sweet wine, but it has got freshness. I don't feel like those fruits are too dried. I've got almost a cold compote. I want to put it with honey and yogurt. That's dangerous. But it is that kind of, how would I describe it? Yeah, a fresh fruit compote with a touch of something, maybe chopped mint in it or something like that. And you can drink them. I had a question on service temperature. Ideal service temperatures for port, and does it vary depending on the sweetness level? For me, it's kind of more about the tannins in terms of temperature. So this isn't particularly high in tannins. So I would gladly drink Natura chilled. I would definitely, with the low tannin that has been in long oak aging in your tawnies, I would really drink that chilled. So that's a great question. For your vintage, however, that is tight tannins. And for me, cold tannins are not that pleasant. They often end up being quite astringent. So because I know this is a lighter tannin type of port, I might therefore choose to chill it. Certainly on a warmer day, it would actually go really beautifully with a very, you know, summery pudding dessert. I think the tawny might go better, but that's personal choice. But you could definitely have it with a kind of summer fruit pudding. You could equally have it with chocolate in front of the fire afterwards. So whatever floats your boat. But service temperature is a great question. And for me, it's not about sweetness, it's about tannins. So on that note, I've made one of the ugliest slides of all time. And I'm going to try and whip through it, but of course I'll send this to you afterwards. For anybody studying, please don't take this as sort of a revision aid. It's it's my way of trying to show you or demonstrate that there are lots of styles of port, but once you understand the basic principles, they're not that intimidating. So don't be afraid. It's going to be okay. Let's deal with white and pink port first, because they are sort of a law unto themselves. And I've simplified this. Not all ports are created equal. And here it's very easy to say, oh, vintage port, that's the best one. You can get amazing white ports, and you can get white ports in lots of different styles. So it's worth saying they're just different. White and pink are different. It doesn't mean they're any less because I've put them separately, and you could do an entire event on white port and get 10 different styles. But let's just keep it simple tonight, because otherwise we'll be here forever. So white port is made with white grapes. Unsurprisingly, perhaps some surprises, but no, white port, white grapes. Most of them are young. Some of them can be aged in wood, some of them even tawny aged. But the reality is that white ports are mainly young. They are amazing with tonic. They're sort of my husband hated port until we went to Porto years and years ago, and now he loves chilled tawny port and pastel de nata, and he loves white port with a bit of tonic and a sprig of mint in the summer. So it's an amazing mixer, but you can have it like a long drink, but you can have it alone as well. Most white ports I'd chill, but some of them are quite serious aged. Pink port, this was actually created by Croft. Now very popular. It's similar to rosé in many senses. It's made with the red grapes, but less time on skins, and they make that quick, rapid, fast fermentation at hot temperature, as I talked about. They do that at slightly cooler. Now, there are then two big groups of red ports. So the reason I wanted you to have a ruby first is that ruby is almost arguably port in its purest form. But ruby is also the group name for some of the most significant ports. So I've put ruby across the top, but let's start at the left. There are types of ports that are ruby, and we call it ruby because of the color. Tawny, because of the color, means that it's had some oxygen in it. So if we imagine ruby ports are, the reason I've put this at the top, ports that have not had too much oxygen and are designed to be aged, if at all, in a bottle. So we kind of think of them almost as your red wines that don't like too much age. Some of them do. It's a horrible way to think about it, but basic ruby is born young. And almost you could argue that some of these going up the scale, when we start to talk about vintage, you can enjoy them young and old, but I don't want to rock too many boats on there. But ruby, blended rubies, there are three types. There's the regular ruby. It's made in big, large vats. They put lots of different years of harvest together, and they're only allowed to age it for a maximum of 3 years in a big barrel. So you drink it young. It's very fruity. It's very easy. It's really popular in France. Unbelievably so, but as an aperitif, not as an end of dinner drink. Underneath it, I've put Ruby Reserve, and I apologize for it falling off the line. But these are the wines, as we've just tried, made with more premium quality grapes. So you get more intensity of fruit. They are, because of that intensity, are allowed to be aged in those big barrels for just a bit longer. So 5 years, i.e. this has had the maximum. So we've just had a Graham's that's had 6 years age, 5 in barrel, and it's a top quality Ruby Reserve. Moving along the line, you get crusted, which sounds horrendous, but is delicious. Crusted ports were invented by the Symington family. Again, you'll see they're a ruby port, they're a blend of years, but here they treat them a bit more like a vintage. So you often hear people call crusted port poor man's vintage port. It is bottled young. They don't fine or filter it, which means you get the crust. And that not fining or filtering allows the bottle to develop age, not a big oak barrel, a bottle. And you can only release after 3 years after the vintage. So again, it's good, cheap alternative to a vintage. However, it does need decanting. So if you buy a crusted port, be sure to decant it. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a lot of friends in your glass. Then we move on to the single vintage styles. I've written single vintage styles on purpose because all of these wines are produced using 1 year's worth of grapes. And I struggle sometimes with the word vintage because vintage, declaring a vintage import means that you think that the grapes are the absolute best, and therefore this is going to be a year where we release a single vintage port. However, vintage really just translates as year. So single vintage style, let's just call it a single year style for complete clarity. The first of which we've got here is LBV, which stands for late bottled vintage. This particular style was invented by Taylor Fladgate Group. I think it was Taylor specifically, to be honest with you, in the 70s or 60s. And it's similar in some ways to a Ruby Reserve that we've just had. But instead of it being blended years, it's a single year. So what they did is they said, hey, that's great. People love this style of wine, this ever so slightly longer aged, but not oxidative oaky style. But we don't want to blend years together. We want to make them in a single year. So what they do is they basically take these big old casks and they fill them with 1 year. Yeah. Then they don't filter them. But because they're in a big cask, the sediment tends to drop to the bottom. And you will sometimes see unfiltered versions. However, mostly to make it easy for the consumer, because it's a late bottled vintage, you want to just get it and go. You don't want to faff around. It's not a vintage port. It's this kind of midway mark. Most of them, you do filter them. So there's no sediment. They're good to go. They come in a cap like this. You pop them and go. The main difference between that and a Ruby Reserve is that they're just using 1 year of exceptional grapes rather than blending them together. It's a really nice way to enjoy an older wine, but more quickly, which I think is quite clever. Then we move on to vintage, which is probably where many of you are very excited. Vintage ports are, Mahesh has just said, we are selling a 2015 LBV, late bottled vintage, and we are about to start selling the 2017 late bottled vintage society label. So if you're keen to try this style of wine, then have a look, because they are really interesting. Crusted ports and LBVs, I've already seen, somebody said Society's Crusted is great value for money, in my opinion. Those two particular wines, Crusted and LBV, are sort of earmarked as being the value for money instead of a vintage. So do look out for those, do try those styles. But vintage port, I touched on it earlier. Vintage is essentially, you've got your grapes, they've been really good. You're so lucky. You almost know when they're so special when they come in. You've had a really good year. Everything's healthy. Everything's just as it should be. They keep them in their own big barrels, so they don't blend those wines. And they keep tasting and they say, yeah, these are really good. Then between the 1st of January and the 30th of September, they have to tell something called the IVDP, which is like the body that governs over port production. They have to tell them, so the second year after harvest, 1st of January to 30th of September, 2020 was amazing. We will be declaring it as a vintage. And that's what that means. They then need to bottle those wines, never 2020 bottles. Please don't take the words out of my mouth. I'm not I'm not declaring vintages left, right, and center, but they would say, right, 2020 was so good, we're going to put just that year in that bottle. Now, if the following St. George's Day, they declare to the public, and that means they release the wines, and you can release it from your house. So you would say Graham's are declaring a vintage this year. So Graham's declared a wonderful vintage in 2000, for example. But that doesn't mean that everybody has to. Somebody might say, actually, we didn't have a great year this year, so we're not going to declare a vintage. There tends to be about 3 universally declared, i.e. almost everyone says amazing, 3 of those every decade. Sometimes they come in trios, and actually often they do, and nobody really knows why. But often they come in trios, sometimes they're spread out, but on average, really, you're looking at about 3 per decade. Now, if I were Graham's saying, right, my 2000 is amazing, Graham's actually take different sites. So they don't just say, I'm going to produce wine from this vineyard because it was so amazing. They say, hold on, all of the Graham's vineyards were incredible. So they pick lots of different sites. And that's how they make Graham's own blend so consistent, but with a vintage stamp on it. So that's how vintages are born. They're very high tannins. They're very intense. They are bottled young, so hence why it lives under the Ruby bottled banner. They don't put loads of oak and oxygen on them. They instead develop bottle age. So for the tawny we're about to go on to, which don't worry, I will stop talking in a second. For the tawny styles, they've seen so much oxygen, they're nutty. For the vintage port styles of this ruby category, they're more intense, but they're dried fruits and sometimes quite hard to manage when they're young. So sometimes they do need that age and they need that development, but it's not development coming from big barrels of oak. It's development coming inside the bottle. Because of that, it drops a huge sediment, and so vintage port must be decanted. Last but not least, we're going to go to single quinta, and then I promise we're going to drink some tawny port. But single quinta wines are they're a struggle to explain, I think, to many people. Single quintas are often declared when the full vintage isn't. So we have a single quinta 2015 at the end of the tasting. I didn't want to do it now because we'll ruin our poor tawny, but a single quinta wine is one of those individual vineyard sites that in a really amazing year might go into a full blend. So you might find, Quinta de Rueda, just to give you an example, before we go on to the tawny anyway, Quinta de Rueda is a quinta. It's a chateau or a plot or a little designated area usually with a house, but a vineyard site specific. Quinta de Rueda goes into Croft normally. But this year, they pulled the Quinta de Rueda, I'll talk about why in a minute, but they pulled this quinta out and they bottled it an individual year and an individual site. And so for many, when they don't want to make a full declaration, they actually pick out something really beautiful and say, let's celebrate this. So actually it's site specific. So they're almost, they're almost vintages within vintages. They're beautiful. And in fact, there's now a thing called super lagars, which is not even just taking a plot of vines, it's taking a lagar. So taking one of those big granite or big stainless steel, as you saw, one of those troughs almost, and saying, this is a tiny small amount of this, but it's amazing. So there are a few now, I think. So there's a quinta called Quinta de Naval, and they made one called Quinta de Naval Nacional, which is one particular variety within the quinta. And they were sort of the first, but now there's Grahamstone Terraces, which is actually in Quinta de Malvedos. So they've got a few rows of vines that they pull out if they're really exceptional. So you get all these super lagars, which I think is an amazing name. That being said, I mentioned earlier in the beginning of the session that one of the beautiful things about port is that it gets complexity from almost being quite complicated in terms of the blending. And while single quintas are amazing and you can taste a sense of place, a lot of people say that the vintages are still better. I think the jury's out on this. A lot of people say the complexity that comes from a vintage, which is a blend of lots of different sites of the same year, if you imagine it like, picking lots of places from the same year, a lot of people think that's better. I think we can argue until the cows come home, but they're all delicious. I'll get this up, but I'm going to move on to the tawny quickly, and then we'll talk about the tawnies afterwards. But I just want to show you where this lands on our diagram. Then we'll taste it, and then we'll come back to it. Lands here at 10YO on the diagram, so hopefully you can see that. So it is a blended tawny, and it's got an average age indication. So we will come back to that, but don't worry. But let's talk about it first and taste it, because that would be nice. So this is made for us by tailors. It's a specific blend exclusively for us again. I mentioned earlier it's on the drier side, so it's slightly less sweet than some 10-year-old tawnies can be. It's had some oak, and these are sorry, I have got some. Here we go. So this is actually in Taylor's, but this is too large an oak barrel. This is one of the huge oak barrels that you often see in port. These are blending barrels. The real good stuff happens in the aging barrels, which are these barrels, and they are called pipes. And essentially, when you're making a tawny port, you put it into these pipes, and all of the oxygen access that can happen, all of the oxygen changes the actual DNA of the wine, and it changes the color. So for anyone tasting along, you will hopefully have a beautiful browned color. I like to think of 10-year-old tawnies, because they're an average age of 10 years older than them. I like to think of the 10-year-old tawnies as more of a sort of terracotta. But they're really special wines, and I love a tawny, and I do prefer a tawny slightly chilled, particularly the younger styles. But they are on the nose. The main difference, if you've got two side by side, do give them a go. For me now, my Reserve Ruby is chocolate and mint, and my tawny is nutty and figgy and caramel and coffee. I know I got mocha in the first one, but I'm getting more coffee here. Proper espresso. But it is more of that nut, fig, pecan nut, walnut. And this is only 10 years old. This is a 10-year-old tawny. Imagine the 40-year-olds, they really develop. 10-year-olds tend to be the easiest drinking of those age-designated wines. They're kind of quaffable tawnies. So let's have a taste. Amazing. So I'm getting far more red fruit. I'm getting like dried strawberries, dehydrated strawberries, figs, some raspberries. It's a little jammy in a good way, but really quite savory. So that finish is quite salty for me. Salted nuts. It's definitely got the toffee, caramel, something like that going on. Yeah, I mean, they're quite amazing wines for the price. I think also they come in such beautiful big large bottles, which I know is a mad thing to say, but they have the gorgeous shoulders on them, a little bit like the reservers do as well. They've got the big large shoulders on. They look pretty like they mean business. But these are the wines that for me go with so many lovely desserts. We had a 30-year-old tawny when we were in Porto with a tarte tatin that Graham served us, which was amazing. You know, that kind of red apple skin coming through. It's beautiful. For me, this is being on the slightly drier side. You could go for a pastel de nata, which is the classic pairing. But I think Joe's put it on here. It's a great cheese wine. Yes, subtle nuts, and it will go with the creamy savouriness of Stilton. So slightly more savoury, I think, is how I would describe this one. You can get tawnies that are much sweeter, and that will all depend on when they put that brandy in during the fermentation process. So let's go back to tawnies whilst we taste a tawny, and then I promise we'll be much quicker on the tawnies. They're much less complicated. That's why we love the tawnies. So you've got essentially a a basic tawny, should we say, a bit like you have a basic ruby. It's lots of years blended together, but those ones, and this is a bit of a misnomer, they're probably the only ones that aren't put in a cask in the tawny family. What they tend to do is, if it's just says tawny on the bottle, they're really cheap, and they often heat them up to basically cook them and get these sorts of flavors and colors, but of nowhere near the quality. So we'll leave tawny. What we'll do is we'll then go on to tawny reserve. Tawny reserve has to have 6 years in an old oak barrel, and in a small oak barrel. And those small oak barrels I mentioned, the oxygen attacks the color, it develops the flavors. Those pipes that I showed you are about it depends, 600 to 650 or 640 capacity. And so you're getting a lot more. If you imagine 6 years in a barrel like that, the wine is going to have undergone quite a lot of oxygenation. And that's when you start to get these beautiful nut characters. The tawny with an age indication, we've just tasted one. We tasted a 10-year-old. It's the average age. So just to make you aware. So it's 10 years on average. It's quite hard to tell exactly because you've obviously got this barrel is from this year and this barrel's from this year. But they blend them all together, and it's often a very ongoing process. They might be adding a little bit in here and there and saying, no, it's still not ready. Let's blend some more in. And so obviously it has to end up being a bit of an approximation. And I mentioned the IVDP earlier, the body that governs port. They need to submit the tawnies for a taste test to ensure that they're in keeping with the style. So all of these can be amazing wines. The older the average, the more developed the fruit. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's better, although often they are more expensive, naturally, because you've had 40 years of storage in their lovely houses in Villanova de Gaia. But you go from this kind of light dried fig to proper caramelized, desiccated fruit, and you can taste the whole way in between. So if you ever get chance, one of the best tastings I have ever done is tasting the same producer and going 10, 20, 30, 40-year-olds. However, there are special pipes that show this incredible character and finesse, and they're like the sort of golden children of the tawny world. So instead of them even going into these blends, they pull them out, and they're called colheitas, and literally translates as harvest, colheita. And so they have to have minimum 7 years, in a pipe. But of course, most of them have older, because at some point they've been rejected from probably a 40-year-old blend. So actually you can taste colheitas that are 50, 60, even 100 years old, and they are drops of history. They're some of the most amazing wines. And when you buy a colheita, you get the harvest year. So genuinely, let's say there are some 1930s knocking around, but then you'll also get the year it was bottled. And then using those two numbers, you can work out how much age in the barrel it had, so how much oxidation, and how much age in the bottle, so all of those extra tertiary parts. So colheita wines are so special. Of course, you're going to be paying a price for it, but they are incredibly, incredibly rare and beautiful. So there are a few butts knocking around and a few pipes knocking around where people decide to save them up and bottle them later, which is very exciting. So I've just had a question in about the pipes, so I'm going to answer that first before we move on, because we are looking at lots of different sizes of barrels here. And this is sorry, it's not Anthony at all, it's Harry Symington down here. The barrels are not used for anything first. Somebody's asked. No is the answer. They are made exclusively for the port houses, and often they will mend rather than buy new. So very similar to Rioja in that sense. They'll be adding staves in to fix them. They don't want brand new wood. It's not really a good look. So occasionally they have to buy a new barrel, but they'll make sure that that's being blended into a full vat. The whole point is it's old oak. We're getting oxygen, but not vanilla, vanilla or cedarwood party. So let's go. Let's go and have let's have a quick talk about varieties, actually, because and then I'm going to go on to questions and talk final wine, because conscious of time. I won't dwell on the varieties too much. There are over 80, and there are over 30 that are still really being used in modern production. Realistically, there's 5. There's 5 that you will see or get knowledge of being heard about. So I'll talk those, then we'll taste, and then I'll do questions. Tourigo Nacional is the most famous. You heard me mention earlier a single Quinta wine that's made exclusively of Nacional. It is hardly found. I mean, I've never tasted or seen one grown outside the Douro, but it is it's incredible, Tourigo Nacional. It's small, it's got thick skins, it's really low yielding, it's got this incredible dark concentrated fruit. So your Tourigo Nacionals are going to be the things, it's going to be making up a huge proportion of your very, very age-worthy wine, like our final wine. To balance that, if you think about that as, for anybody who's more familiar with, let's say, Bordeaux, Tourigo Nacional is your Cabernet Sauvignon of the Bordeaux world. It's the one that adds the structure, the power, small, thick skin berries, so you get lots of tannins, dark fruits. Your Tinta Barroca is a little bit more like the Merlot, so it makes these sort of soft, sweeter wines, really beautiful blending partner to help some of those more austere varieties be a bit gentler. It can create quite a lot of sugar, so they don't need to grow it in bright sunshine. So they can grow it in some of the shadier sections that don't get full sun, which is beautiful. So Tinta Barroca tends to be a really good, a good blending partner for an easier drinking style. Tourigo Franca, also known as Francesca, is, I believe, the most widely planted variety in the Douro. Very consistent, very intense. It's actually similar to Nacional, but it's slightly more floral. And there are still lots more plantings going on because it does give good tannin. And I think Tourigo Franca, for me, is probably, it's maybe the undersung one. Nacional takes all the praise. And I think actually Franca is worthy of all our time, or Francesca, as it was called. Tinta Roriz was the one I mentioned at the beginning, which is the same as Tempranillo in Spain. I've heard people before say that the Tinta Roriz is not anywhere near as good as you get in places like Ribera del Duero or Rioja. It is good colour, good structure, but it's not considered the finest of the grapes. And then the 5th grape, currently in small amounts, but I think really on the up. The reason it's in small amounts is the benefacio, which we haven't had time to talk about, the way that the producers buy grapes, was done on weight. And much like how producers growing grapes and buying them, it's a bit of an open market in Champagne, or was. You used to buy on weight. That was the easiest way to do it. So Tinta Cow was a variety that produced very low yields. So there wasn't much of it. So of course the producers didn't pay as much for it. There wasn't a quality kind of exchange. It was just on weight. So loads of people ripped it up. But actually, very good at drought, very good with heat, really beautiful acidity. And although it's quite tough when it's young, it develops very nicely with age. So what was quite a low priority for growers is now quite a high priority, because growers are suddenly getting paid more for it. And it's really good in vintage wines. So Tinta Cow is going to be one to look out for. Everyone says it's dog strangler, but I don't think it is. I think it's grape of red of the dog. I could be wrong. I think it's one of those wine myths. It doesn't translate as dog strangler. So let's go on to our last wine. I'm really excited to show you it. And then we're going to answer some questions, because I think I would say we've had more questions today than we've had in a really long time. And I'm not surprised. Beth just said this is a whole new world of wine. I mean, it really is. I apologize. I knew it was going to be a busy session tonight. It feels like I've had to give a lot of information. I hope that some of you do go back and have a watch if you're interested or confused. Or I think the main takeaway I want everyone to have is the 2 considerable different styles of port. That ruby style versus that tawny style, and how they're different. We started with a ruby style with that intense, tight, fresh berry flavour. We then went on to a tawny, which was this caramelized, red fruited almost, but very much figgy and nutty. And that's a young one. And now we're going into a single Quinta vintage. Many would say this is too young to drink. The nice thing about Quinta wines is they tend to, because they haven't had all the complexity of blending lots of parcels, they tend to be ready younger. So Joe has actually put this as ready 2 years ago. Yes, 2020 to 2035. And Quinta Douro is, I mentioned earlier, part of the Croft blend, but they singled out this vintage to bottle it alone. It's quite an extensive vineyard area of old vines, but they have added some more recent plantations. And if we go right back to the beginning, that map I showed you, and there were 3 sections, so Baixa and then Cima Corgo in the middle section before you get to the Douro Superior. The Cima Corgo, which is that middle part, has a beautiful town called Pinhão right in the middle that I mentioned. And this is just upstream of the village. It's definitely not a town. I don't know why I said that. The village of Pinhão. And it is where there's a real epicenter of quality production. But here what's interesting is there's been a huge amount of investment in this quinta. And the investment has been to reintroduce foot treading and to add, oh sorry, someone has said Mourvedre, aka the dog strangler. Yeah, Monastrell. Yeah, I think Tinta Cow is the red of the dog. I can't remember, and I will be honest, I don't speak Portuguese, so you will have to forgive me. But the amazing thing about this wine is they've invested in almost going back to basics, and it's not basics, it's sort of basics on times 100. But they've built new legars, so the big troughs. They've reintroduced foot treading, so they're trying to go back to traditional, but with really high quality kit. Because Croft is one of, if not the oldest porthouse, but it didn't fall out of disrepute, but it had a long time where it was out of the Taylor Flagrate Group ownership. It didn't have enough investment. And then I think Joe mentions the upward trajectory. Yeah, there's a lot going into Croft. So at the moment, Croft is a really, really good buy. And this single quinta as well. 2015 was very dry, very intense, amazing conditions here. So it means that this particular vintage is fantastic. Having a smell, you might think, oh, it's not as open as the first wine. And that's why I recommended for those who got my email to decant this if they wanted to. But really, it just needs a good swirl. And if you are carrying on with your bottle, please decant it, not only to get some more oxygen, but to stop the sediment as well, or stop drinking the sediment, rather. But it's sort of almost more licorice. It's got that damson, which I love. It's very fruity, but also that more savory character to me. It's got a bit of earthiness. It's got a bit of cigar box. And licorice. I'm also getting black pepper on the nose. And I didn't get that earlier, which makes me so excited. When I tasted all these earlier, oh, I'm getting that a lot now. How fun. Let's have a taste. You should expect, if you're tasting anything like a Quinta and a Reserva side by side, the tannins will be so much higher in your Quinta unless you're drinking a very old one. So let's have a taste, and then I'm going to whistle through a couple of questions and you can hang around if you want, but I do appreciate I might be 1 or 2 minutes over. I could already feel it when the moment it went into my mouth. It was so much more dense and intense. I'm getting this amazing acid and tannin down the side of my mouth. It's sort of furry and grippy. And it's got similar fruit profile to the first, but it's almost a tighter, punchier, weightier, more hardcore version of the first wine. And it's a little bit less fruity. So there's still some lovely sweet fruit on there, but it's got a bit more of that spice and that pepper, which is amazing. Joe did call this an incredible bargain, so I apologize if you didn't manage to get any. However, the thing I would say is look for Croft as it's on the up, but look for single Quinta wines. I tasted a lot of single Quintas when I was there. We were staying in a Quinta, Malveros. And because we were staying in that Quinta, we did try a lot of the single Quinta Malveros. My goodness, it's good. So single quintas are not to be sniffed at. They are incredibly good value. And they're not cheap, but it means you can drink them younger. So a lot of people often say to me, oh, but what if I want to drink it now? I love vintage port, but it's so expensive to buy old vintages. You can buy old vintages of Quinta wines that are ready to drink for much cheaper. So worth looking out for them. I'm going to whistle through a few questions. Fun one from Sarah. Is port Portugal's greatest export? That feels like a loaded question. For me, it's the most romantic wine export in Portugal for sure, but I also love Madeira, which is also Portuguese, and I love a lot of the white wines. I even love a lot of the red wines, particularly even the Douro red wines. My God, they're good. So pardon me. Is it Portugal's greatest export? Maybe, but I also think it does win for me on the romantic. There's no wine region quite like it. Somebody's asked which would be better at Christmas. I've had two people ask me a very similar question. Which would be better to serve at Christmas, with a cheese board and a Christmas pudding? Great question. I actually think that tawny probably serves across the board the best. Vintage port is not for me a pudding wine. It is a cheese wine. It is a serious, heavy wine that often gets confused when you add a lot of sweetness of something like a Christmas pudding. An old tawny would be a very good bet. Something like a 20-year-old, you're going to match sweetness, dried fruit, but it's also going to have enough guts to stand up against cheese. So that would be my suggestion. And I think I've also answered, oh, Elizabeth has said, I like Christmas pudding with tawny. That would also be my recommendation, Elizabeth. And for the blended years, what's the typical range of years used? The last 3 or 5 years or longer, many years for some of them. So your tawnies are going to be blends of several years. It could be, I mean, in a 40-year-old tawny, it could be a blend of 20 years if it really wanted to. And it's going to be a blend of lots of different butts and barrels and places as well. So they are a real melange of all sorts of things, the tawnies. For your things like your ruby reserves, just by the very nature of them, they're not going to be as many. So they're younger age in cask, so you've got less to work with. But certainly your very old designated tawnies, age designated tawnies are going to be lots. Any ports go with savoury food beyond cheese? Yes, absolutely. I think I would try for lots of nutty things personally. And again, you want to go for your more savoury foods. I have had savoury ports. I have had vintage port with things like beef stews. You have to get used to it, but it definitely works. So do give it a go. It's good fun. Cheese is great, but also tapas. I mentioned that the French quite like to drink ruby port as an aperitif. I think there's something in that. I think ruby maybe less so, but reserve ruby for me sometimes I do think, oh, I could try this with I could try this with some more candied nuts or something like that, and then that would be worth a try. I know they're not savoury, but it's worth giving a go. And then finally, and this is my favourite question, when's a good time to visit Oporto and the upriver regions? My goodness, go whenever. I went the first time I visited Porto and Villanova de Gaia, which is the place opposite that I mentioned. It's actually the town opposite where they age all of the ports. So Porto on one side, Villanova de Gaia on the other, and they're down by the river. Of course, it's down by the river, down by the sea. I visited in February and was in a t-shirt one day and pouring rain the next. And that is Porto for you. It's very rainy, but it's very sunny, and you get this sort of almost tropical experience in Porto. So there is no time to go when it's going to be perfect, and there is no time to go when you won't get a glorious bit of sunshine. Going up the river, on the other hand, I would just say don't go in the height of summer. I went in end of September when I went up the river recently, and that was perfect. Likewise, I think if you went in early May, even April would be beautiful. But when you're going in the height of summer, you're talking about 45 degrees, and nobody wants that. So I would highly recommend, if you are going to do a trip to the whole region, please try and avoid August. Or go to Porto in August. Just don't go up the river in August. Porto in August would be gorgeous. Right. That is me done. And I'm sorry if I didn't get to your questions. Please do feel free to email me them. There were masses of questions tonight. So it was very kind of you to enjoy the evening so much and ask so many. And it looks like I'm going to have to do something else on port in the near future, which I am fine with. So I hope you all have a lovely evening. Thank you, Mahesh, for running over time with me and indulging my port loves. Like I said, please feel free to email. I'm going to send you an email tomorrow and I will suggest and recommend any other styles of port that we're currently selling or any houses to look out for, etc. There was so much to cover in so little time, but we've luckily had the Taylor Flag Grape group and 2 sessions with the Symingtons on YouTube. So I'll also send you the links to those and you can explore them a little more. So thank you all. Good night and enjoy your port.